Berlin, December 31st, 1936. Spartacus Olsson reporting from the German capital. At the end of 1936, German dictator Adolf Hitler fulfilled his promise to subjugate the care of the children of Germany to secure the future of the Nazi racial state, to destroy any future resistance to the Nazi agenda, or as he himself put it in November 1933. When an opponent declares, "I will not come over to your side," I calmly say, "Your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time they will know nothing else but this new community." Tonight, we look back at a quarter when the Nazis quietly drew work, charity, youth, culture, policing, and foreign policy even closer to their preparations for war. The last months of 1936 brought continued international crisis as the Spanish Civil War drew in foreign powers, while Japan's confrontation in China and Germany's pact with Japan sharpened the language of an imperial and fascist anti-communist alignment. In Germany, the overarching event was the normalization of mobilization, binding economic recovery, raw materials, youth education, charity, press language, and racial exclusion into one system of national discipline. Germans are now being trained to experience regimentation not as emergency rule, but as participation in the Volksgemeinschaft. Hermann Göring's new authority over the four-year plan was now taking effect, elevating the politics of autarky and armaments above fiscal responsibility and the freedom of capital. On December 1st, the law against economic sabotage threatened German nationals who moved capital abroad or left assets there with confiscation of property and even potential death. Foreign policy followed the same logic. In late October, German-Italian cooperation edged towards a deeper and more formalized alliance. And on November 1st, Mussolini gave it a name, speaking of a Rome-Berlin axis. On November 18th, Germany and Italy recognized Franco's nationalist regime in Spain. The Nazi regime's domestic press could now present intervention and rearmament as a defense against Bolshevism, providing for the German people not only the fantasy of an internal Jewish enemy, but the image of the Red Threat ready to pounce on the German race. On December 1st, the law on the Hitler Youth was passed. Its first article declared, "All of the German youth in the Reich are organized within the Hitler Youth." The second placed physical, intellectual, and moral education in the spirit of National Socialism, putting the party alongside family and school, effectively eliminating the freedom of parents to choose how to raise their children. The Winterhilfswerk also acquired legal form on December 1st. Charity has now become mandated patriotism, a ritual of belonging to the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial national community. Thus, by December, the regime had not staged another single dramatic coup. It had done something more durable. It had connected the household, the factory, the school, the street collection, the newspaper, and the foreign threat into one pattern. The law regarding the Hitler Youth is another blow to whatever fragile remnants of personal freedom and democratic thought that still survives in the country. By legally entrusting the physical, intellectual, and moral education of all of Germany's children to the National Socialist state, the regime has forcefully bypassed the traditional sanctuaries of the home, the school, and the church, effectively declaring that children are not under their parents' exclusive care and responsibility, but equally belong to the Führer and the nation. The intent is the forced regimentation of an entire generation designed to erase individual identity and replace it with unconditional subordination to the Volksgemeinschaft. Inside the Hitler Jugend and Bund Deutsche Mädel, children are pulled into military-style formations that occupy their free time with exhausting drills, uniform regulations, and radical ideological schooling. Already, there are alarming reports of young teenagers being incited against their own mothers and fathers, alienated from their families and taught to prioritize loyalty to the regime above all else. If the regime succeeds in raising a generation that knows absolutely nothing outside of this radical community, any democratic revival will have to not only fight against terror, but face a generation trained to regard obedience, sheer physical toughness, and militant conformity as normal. We're witnessing the deliberate creation of a compliant, militarized society, a massive cohort of youth being systematically conditioned to execute the regime's most aggressive expansionist and racial ambitions without ever asking a single question. They're quietly being weaponized for conflict. As the regime seized the youth of the country into their firm hands, the Jewish exclusion tightened through yet more administrative measures and daily humiliations. On October 26th, the Gestapo imposed a blanket ban on Jewish meetings. 2 weeks later, it was lifted, but only into a stricter permit system. Applications had to be submitted in writing with subject and speakers named in advance. Academician Victor Klemperer recorded the process at ground level. On October 9th, he was told that as a non-Aryan, he could no longer use the library reading room. On December 8th, he told us that his telephone was removed on December 1st and that he was now completely impoverished and isolated. These anti-Jewish politics not only help define and publicly display who belongs by publicly identifying who does not, they also inflate the imaginary threat that the tiny Jewish minority supposedly poses. The many thousand signs, posters, articles, and decrees spewing anti-Semitic hatred every day, everywhere, now make the 7 Jews per 1,000 Germans look like many more and paints to the Germans a vile caricature of an internal enemy they can blame for any and all of their everyday struggles and distract them from the monstrosity they are actually facing, Nazism. Meanwhile, the Nazi press moved to amplify the threat of the Bolshevik external enemy. While widely publicizing the Anti-Comintern Pact as an essential bulwark against Bolshevik aggression, the Spanish Civil War provided the Nazi press with daily fodder for subtle propaganda. When writing about Franco's fascist front, they present them as the legitimate regime fighting for a pan-European anti-Bolshevist cause, while when they write about the Spanish Republican government, they use quotation marks around government, cabinet, or minister. While putting the focus on enemies abroad, they tightened the communication of collective unity at home. On October 6th, opening the Winterhilfswerk campaign in Berlin, Hitler demanded participation as public discipline. The entire nation shall stand together once again just as in the years past, and he expected every German of decency and character to join. A month later, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels increased his streamlining of cultural expression. It was a reaction to the embarrassment caused by the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded in absentia to pacifist journalist Karl von Ossietzky in recognition of his work to expose to the world German rearmament. Ossietzky was already broken by imprisonment and held under Nazi control, unable to travel to accept the prize, but the news did come out and galled the Nazis. Hence, Goebbels moved to close even more gaps in the walls that insulate the regime from even the vaguest criticism. Among other things, the ministry tightened its control over comedy, with Winter 1936 programming principles for German radio explicitly forbidding humorous sketches to thwart sarcasm, irony, or critical jokes about the Nazis and their thin-skinned leader. On November 28th, Goebbels announced the abolition of the art, theater, and film criticism in its older form. The press is to describe, not judge. The propaganda ministry presented criticism as a residue of Jewish cultural influence, and Goebbels said many critics still followed the typical Jewish manner. It might seem an insignificant detail in the greater subjugation of the press, but it becomes more relevant when you consider that the only art left to critique would be the art the Nazis deem admissible as ideologically pure. Thus, any criticism would be, by extension, of the Nazi ideology. The regime is pursuing the economy with an equally firm but decidedly more inclusive approach. The 4-year plan does not abolish private industry, it harnesses it. Firms retain meaningful autonomy, but within a system increasingly organized around rearmament, import substitution, and war readiness. The economic recovery remains politically decisive. By the end of this year, registered unemployment has fallen from the mass crisis of 1932 to roughly 1.6 million, while industrial production has reached its late 1920s peak. But as this reporter has repeatedly emphasized, the unemployment figures are not wholly reflective of reality, as many unemployed have simply been eliminated from the statistics. By the close of 1936, the German economy is no longer simply recovering, it is being manipulated and redirected. The figures tell the story more plainly than any slogan. Across the armament cycle now underway, state demand is rising at a pace without precedent, an average of roughly 26% a year since 1932, increasing the state's share of total national output from about 13.6 predicted to rise to about 30% by 1938. It is not the state subsuming the economy wholesale as in the USSR. It is a state inserting masses of money into the private economy while firmly directing the spending towards rearmament. The money they are spending they do not have, and as a nominal market economy still exists, inserting more money by printing it risks hyperinflation. The regime knows what runaway inflation once did to German society, so it is trying to spend on a colossal scale while preventing prices and wages from breaking loose. This autumn, prices were frozen by decree, wages remain held down. Meanwhile, owners of business are still free to profit from their entrepreneurship, but their freedom to raise money in the old way is narrowed, while government debt and military needs take precedence. For those needs, Germany must have oil, metals, rubber, and other goods from abroad, but lacks the foreign currency to buy them freely. The true economic meaning of the four-year plan is that Germany is being prepared to endure blockade, shortage, and war, and the plan sharpens the state's tools and tightens its controls to achieve that. And as the Nazis constricted their control of all aspects of society, the mood inside the party was confident but impatient and increasingly intolerant of any independent space. Göring's rise signaled that caution was being abandoned even further. In essence, to Hitler, Hjalmar Schacht's model of constrained recovery looked less useful than Göring's promise of speed, force, and political obedience. Goebbels' cultural offensive and the end of traditional criticism was celebrated as a victory against the Nazis' eternal imagined enemy, or as he put it, the process of purifying our culture of Jews has been fully completed. It was a boast he dared now that the leadership believes the summer's Olympic pretense at respectability has passed without cost, that foreign alignments are widening, and that German society can now be pushed harder. The remaining problem is not consent in principle, it is tempo, how rapidly the regime can force economy, culture, and society into the shape required by its racial militarist program. The reaction among the German public seems to be based on introspective measurement of the absence of economic disaster. Klemperer told us of how recently a stranger on Pragerstraße turned to him with a beaming face. "I got work, the first time in 3 years, and good work at Renner's. They pay well." In other words, for many Germans, the quality of Hitler's dictatorship is measured in just having a wage and employment. To achieve that, the German people are being drilled to endure for now, as expressed to us by Marianne Köhler, a Bavarian schoolgirl. What will the new year bring? We don't know, but we can and should have the will to work on ourselves with eagerness and perseverance, so that when someday life really comes at us, we can be good, solid German beings who also in their place do something for the good of our folk and fatherland. Such youth mobilization reached even anti-Nazi homes. This reporter was told of a 15-year-old daughter of a communist carpenter who recently returned from work camp won over to National Socialism. Her group leader had told the girls, "Do not let your parents lead you astray." When her mother objected, the daughter replied, "You're insulting my leader." In the fourth quarter of 1936, the regime's method was incorporation. It brought economic recovery, youth formation, public charity, anti-Bolshevik diplomacy, and racial exclusion into the same practical world. Employment made dictatorship useful to many Germans. The four-year plan then redirected that usefulness towards rearmament. A worker does not have to think of himself as preparing for war. He can think of himself as employed, disciplined, and participating in recovery. The Hitler Youth Law moved the same process into the family. It does not merely recruit children, it claims them as future political material, weakening parents, churches, and older loyalties. Anti-Bolshevism supplies the moral bridge to unite it all. Spain, the Anti-Comintern Pact, and the axis with Italy allows the regime to present mobilization as protection. Repression of Jews and dissenters can then appear to many not as lawlessness, but as hygiene, order, and national defense. Rejection persists, especially among Jews, leftists, and some liberals and Christians, but it is increasingly privatized. Supporters speak in public language, opponents speak in diaries, cautious visits, and half sentences. But even with growing consent for the Nazis, there is little evidence that the German people want war. Like any normal human being, most of them will prefer peace and tranquility. But they are being taught to accept the conditions that make war possible: discipline, exclusion, obedience, and the belief that national recovery requires enemies. The followers of the regime are surrendering to a minimum of comfort instead of fighting for the aspiration to prosperity. They are capitulating their freedoms in exchange for a cage to protect them from the enemies they have been told are at the gates. They are getting in line for a nightmare of orderly mobilization into a predictable destiny instead of running free into the beautiful chaos of a tomorrow built on dreams. They are retreating into the darkness of a closed community of militarist consistency instead of wandering out into the basking sunshine of human multiplicity and innovation. They have not surrendered to the machine. They are becoming the machine, a German machine, which are said to be efficient tools that perform with mighty power to achieve their purpose. A machine they imagine is simply to produce national recovery, but is in reality built for conquest, racial empire, internal purification, and the destruction of perceived enemies. A doomsday machine designed with deceit, built by fear and constructed with steel, forged by hatred. Never forget. Join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to stand together with us to remember our past successes and failures so that we can build a better, saner world on the foundation of these memories for our children and theirs.